The notion is that, again, there's a real relationship here, and there's reciprocity from the very beginning. A parent, after all, takes care of their children. They care for their children early in life. At one point, when talking about a funeral and how long you should mourn after the death of a parent, Confucius suggests, well, 3 years seems perfectly appropriate because it's 3 years that the child is basically by its parent's side. So there's a kind of balance. And what he's concerned with here is the idea that there's, from the beginning, a notion of mutuality. The idea isn't just that elders sort of rule by fiat. Again, the context of the family is supposed to be a place where everyone is at home. But nevertheless, what parents ideally do is somehow coordinate the harmony, and each individual needs to support that harmony as well. I think it's important to keep in mind that this isn't an ideal of just suppressing yourself. I think that's another caricature in the West that sometimes comes about because of a sense that you really ought to defer to your parents' wishes. Certainly, Confucius acknowledges that it's sometimes important to remonstrate with your father. If you think your father's doing something wrong, his view is, well, it's perfectly appropriate to tell him that that's what you think. Nevertheless, it's not appropriate to do this in public. In other words, you have certain obligations because a person is your father, not to humiliate him in public. At the same time, there's nothing about Confucianism that implies that you shouldn't express your true opinion of what he's doing. In general, the idea is that the family is a context in which people mutually nurture each other. And again, if you think about actual family life, this depends a lot in terms of the fine-tuned details on what the people are like. Suppose you've got several siblings. One is boisterous, another is rather shy, another one is really kind of a dreamer. How to treat those different individuals is something that parents and other members of the family learn by means of really cultivating that particular relationship. It isn't always exactly the same thing that you say to several children if they have different temperaments, for example. And that's sort of built into this vision of the family as the core unit of social harmony. So filial piety, the sense that the younger person really owes respect to their parents and to their ancestors generally, is something that reflects this whole sense of mutual support that a family is designed to be. Perhaps the most universal or general kind of virtue in the Confucian scheme of things is the virtue of Ren. This is another virtue that is spelled differently in the two common systems of transliteration. It's spelled R-E-N or J-E-N, but pronounced Ren. And this term basically means something along the lines of humanity, benevolence. Occasionally it's translated as compassion, but I think it's usually meant a bit more broadly. And you might say, well, this does sum up virtuous behavior. I mean, if you're really humane in your dealings with other people, if you're really a benevolent being, that carries a lot of virtues with it. Confucius accepts a doctrine called the unity of the virtues. And this is an answer to an issue that comes up in Western thought as well as in Chinese thought. The question is, if a person has one virtue, is that supportive of all the other virtues, or might it not conflict with some virtues? Friedrich Nietzsche in the 19th century argued that if you cultivate one set of virtues at times, this can really contradict others, that people have different traits, and you shouldn't necessarily try to have a kind of package that brings all of these traits together. Confucius doesn't accept that. He, along with Aristotle in the West, contends that the virtues really ought to work hand in hand. And you might see Ren as a kind of capstone that brings them all together. A person that you could really say is a benevolent person, a really humane person, is someone who is exemplary. Confucius suggests this notion in part when he talks about a single unifying thread to his teachings. Another passage from the Analects. Tsugung asked, saying, Is there any single saying that one can act upon all day and every day? The master said, perhaps the saying about consideration. Never do to others what you would not like them to do to you. Well, that sounds fairly familiar, I think, to most of us. It seems, after all, a version of the Golden Rule. Though I think it's important that it's phrased somewhat differently from the way we in the West often hear the Golden Rule. I think the Golden Rule is usually expressed, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This one, this formulation says, don't do to others what you would not want them to do to you. And I think that there are some things that are maybe implied about the relationality of interaction with people that's implicit just in this negative formulation. If you think that you should do unto others what you would have them do unto you, in a way you're kind of projecting from your own preferences to what other people's are. And oftentimes this is reasonable enough. But it isn't necessarily paying a lot of attention to what's unique about that person. Whereas if you talk about don't do unto others what you would not want someone to do to you, in a way it's kind of suggesting that you try on their position, I think, a little bit more. Suppose you were in their position. How would you want someone to treat them? Discussion about how superiors and inferiors in hierarchical organizations interact, for example, can take the form of trying to think this through. Suppose you were the supervisor. How would you behave in this situation? How would you think things ought to go? Suppose you were the employee. If you were in that position, how would you want to be treated? These kind of questions help you to imaginatively think about the other person's position in relation to yourself. And although it's not a huge change of emphasis, I think the emphasis is somewhat important. Because again, there's a sense that there's always a texture of relationships that you are connected with yourself. I mean, your own sense of self is very much bound to how you're connected with other people. And your position in terms of social harmony and society depends very much on all of these relationships. But they're very different relationships. I mean, the fact is that people do have different personalities. People have different concerns. Their positions are different. So what this negative formulation allows you to do is try to imaginatively think about what it would be like to be in this different position. And that's indeed something that Confucius encourages very consistently. Always consider what the other person might want and need in this context, even if it's very foreign to your own situation. Perhaps I should say here that Confucius is always assuming that there is a hierarchical organization. I think in the United States, where we tend to focus a lot on the principle of equality, this might seem a little bit foreign. But he is assuming that there will always be some people in charge of other people. He doesn't see any problem at all with having a ruler that's sort of the central head of government. However, what he focuses on in talking about how that ought to happen well is focusing on the way the ruler ought to be nurturing society. The ruler's real role is to cultivate social harmony. Indeed, anyone's role ought to be, in part, to cultivate social harmony, but the ruler is in a distinct position, a position that can either result in a lot of harm to society if the ruler isn't very concerned about this responsibility, or a role that can really do a lot of good for society. So again, this image of the parent and child, in this case, the ruler is visualized as somewhat like a parent whose responsibility is to take care of this large family, in effect. And even though there's more power that comes with that, nevertheless, that's what's really important. So Confucius does spend a fair amount of time talking about what is really the right way to rule. And this notion of trying to do it responsibly as a parent, out of real concern for your society, is absolutely crucial. This brings up another term that is, I think, quite interesting, and we'll see it used somewhat differently in Taoism than in Confucianism. But the term is de, spelled either de or te in transliteration. De means moral force or power. essentially it means force or power, but in the Confucian context, it's typically used in connection with real moral power. Confucius believes that the person who rules with authority by virtue of being an exemplary person, someone who has real moral authority, has a tremendous amount of effectiveness. For example, according to the Analects, the master said, "He who rules by moral force, or de, is like the pole star, which remains in its place while all the lesser stars do homage to it."